The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and this sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, this is the Scottish Independence Podcast episode 2. For this one, which was recorded about a month ago, I was in Oxford to meet Andrew Tickell, or Lallands Peat Worrier. Andrew is a PhD student in Oxford, he's an occasional contributor to Newsnight, and he writes for various blogs. His own blog is lallandspeatworrier.blogspot.co.uk. It was a nice summer day in Oxford. The noises you can hear in the background are all the tourists running around in Oxford. And I'd actually had quite a heavy night out for a staff do the night before, but Andrew was very nice and he went easy on me. And we actually did this over a bottle of something quite nice. So we'll just go straight to the conversation again, and we'll have a wee word at the end. I hope you enjoy. Alright, I'm here with Lallands Peat Worrier, who's just off the back of Newsnight and was a witness to a major meltdown. So the first thing is, I'll start you with the same question I started with Donald Adamson, which is, after 305 years, do you think the union's reaching the end of its trial period?
Oh dear, which sort of suggests it's going to go into a period in which it would be either come full good, would become, I don't know. I think it's really tricky to say in terms of, I suppose underneath your question is another one, which is it over? Are we going to win the independence referendum? Are we going to lose? I know several people who feel very confident. I'm not really one of them at this stage. I'm a bit sceptical at the present moment about whether that trial stage won't become a full-blown continuing union for a further period of time, I'm afraid.
What do you think it might move to Devo Max option instead?
Here it's really tricky, that, and it comes back to another question, which is how many questions are we going to have in this referendum, which, as far as I can see, still isn't clear for a whole set of reasons. It's not clear what the SNP want, or at least what the SNP leadership want, whether they want 2 questions, which will obviously have a big impact on what happens afterwards. I mean, I think one of the reasons why people want to have a Devo Max question is because they are worried about the nature of the British state if they don't have one. You know, imagine you're a nationalist, or imagine you are a pro-devolutionist that doesn't want to see nationalism crash and burn into disaster, that doesn't want to see an embarrassing defeat for the nation, kind of damaging. Then actually, how do you achieve more devolution in the United Kingdom? If you are a sceptic, you might think, well, if independence loses 30-something%, 40-something %, then without a second question which strongly endorses more devolution, it'll be a triumphant reaffirmation of the British state, and, you know, it just won't happen. Like electoral reform, AV defeated, PR ain't coming. That's the kind of worry, I think, for people who are in favour of...
Do you think if there is a no vote, there's likely to be consequences?
There's always consequences, I suppose. Though it's interesting, difficult to see what they would be immediately, clearly. I mean, obviously, there'd be consequences for the SNP, as a political party, which would be actually very interesting to see unfold, because the SNP is a problematic political group at the best of times, but will become all the more so if their central goal doesn't materialise. But I mean, for the Labour Party, to talk in just party political terms, there's obviously will be a pressure to come up with something for the next general election if they're going to kind of walk the walk of doing more devolution and being a bit more serious-minded about their goals. And for the nation, well, I mean, it's going to be an interesting moment. I mean, because we're going to be talking about the nation, trying to imagine it in different shapes. So whether or not, you know, it results in a new sovereign state being created or not, it will definitely be an interesting phase of trying to imagine Scotland in different ways, which inevitably will have its influence across different parts of life.
And how do you imagine it? If there is a yes vote, although you're thinking it's maybe unlikely at the moment, how would you imagine an independent Scotland to be? What would you like to see from it that we don't see as being part of the Union, or that we can't have as being part of the Union?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very large question, isn't it? I mean, I think, well, one of the things, I mean, I'm an adherent to the idea that Britain is a defunct kind of state. It doesn't operate in a meaningful way. It doesn't serve the kind of public goods and public goals that I'd want to see in terms of social justice. You know, the fact that we can't even reform the House of Lords shows you that we're in a kind of mad, backward, constitutional basket case of a state, which I think we can fix in independent Scotland. Is quite easy to begin to imagine in terms of the sort of fundamental values which would be served by its politics. A democratic value as opposed to a hereditary one would be a good start. But there's awful a lot up in the air. I mean, I really think that we don't at this stage have a kind of full-on Scottish politics yet. We don't take tricky choices about taxation, which undoubtedly will materialise when you make your own choices about these areas. That, you know, this idea of, for example, Scotland as a left-wing country in tendency has something to it. It's not utterly vapid, but you know, is that this kind of thing which is going to be tested. There's likely to be an emergence of a right-wing, I think, party, or at least right-wing values. You know, for the SNP, it will be quite telling. I mean, I'm in favour of the Scottish National Party breaking up into a kind of more satisfactory, more ideological grouping, so we can actually have a kind of proper politics. I mean, and that's again one of the features of this kind of hegemonic, rather cosy political structure we have at the moment. Everyone's got such kind of everyone's so well intentioned that we don't really have a sort of proper kind of politics which really has a go with each other and really talks about these different ideological choices in a kind of clear-sighted and honest way. Instead, we have mixter maxter political parties. So I think there might be pressure to kind of clarify some of that, but equally, you know, the muddy forces will go all the other direction. For the SNP, the urge to stay together will be acute, I'm sure. But
yeah, I mean, there's always been a very mixed picture. I mean, recently we've seen Labour for Indy starting up a campaign. But it's always been a very mixed picture with the parties. Like you're saying, the SNP could probably break up after a referendum. Mm-hmm. If it was achieved, then the SNP might become... It's too much of a broad church to stay together. There'd be everybody pulling in too many different directions. The same could happen to Labour and Tory after. I mean, because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, there's no going back. If the independence is achieved, it's absolutely certain that there'd be new parties involved. The whole system would change.
Eventually, I think in the short term it would be quite... The pressures for example, the kind of existing groupings, Labour, SNP, to stick together would be very, very strong. I mean, not at the very least to say that the SNP does deliver independence, then they'd want to be not just the handmaidens of that, but see their child grow up a bit, you know. And there'd be a good, and understandable pressure for kind of social stability, and you know, not everything being suddenly thrown up in the air, which makes me sort of think that it's quite likely that SNP will continue. But then, as you said, how did they deal with this kind of ideological range of views, from sort of social conservatism to social liberalism to views on tax? You know, you meet socialists in the party, to at the other end people who are very keen on, you know, on friendly laugher curves and such like. So I think there's a question there about, well, do you keep the broad church? Option one. Option two, I suppose, is if the SNP to become a more ideologically coherent party, and therefore for those elements which don't fit with whatever the ideological coherent bit should leave and form another party. But it's not clear to me, obviously, whether you would get the kind of economically more left-wing, socially more liberal part taking over and becoming the Scottish National Party, or whether the Scottish National Party would become the other side of things, the rural and so on.
Yeah, it's an open question, and also I think a lot of people who vote SNP after an independence vote might not continue to vote for SNP as well after that single issue.
I mean, against that, I suppose the point is that most, as we never tire of hearing, most SNP voters do not vote for the party because of their perspective on independence, which would be another reason to perhaps stick together for a kind of lumpy community of the realm centre. You know, I shouldn't be so cheeky about them, but you know, there's another reason to perhaps do that, to have displaced Labour in that position. Of course, and let's be frank about it, when you've got your hands on power, very tempting to keep your hands on power, as opposed to a self-denying ordinance that just obliterates your own.
Yeah, which is the same reason we've never had electoral reform in the United Kingdom, because once you've got your hands on power, then... Yeah,
but in that case it's much more female, I think, you know. But, you know, it's an interesting question, though, about trying to... And it's something which actually conspicuously the SNP has never spoken about. About what do they envisage their own role after independence. I mean, I think one of my friends, historical friends, was talking about Ireland and about how various of the Irish parties were consciously envisaging their own end after Ireland had achieved its independence. Whereas now that's not really an object of discussion. It's probably a sensible thing not to discuss it, but equally it doesn't give you much confidence, I suppose, that the SNP has a clear vision of the after independence situation.
So yeah, to change the subject a bit, you were on Newsnight to witness the meltdown of Ian Davidson the other day, and he was saying that there were legal blocks before a referendum can come about. What's your take on that? Is he right?
It's a complicated question. I mean, the starting point is, does the Scottish Parliament have the power now to hold a referendum on independence? And if you look at the law, my answer is maybe, arguably yes, arguably no, but it's going to end up in court. That might be a tactically desirable thing for some people. I mean, for certain Scottish nationalists, they might get quite excited about the idea of the UK Supreme Court deciding on these matters. But basically, it comes down to this: under the Scotland Act, the Scottish Parliament has all the powers that it has, apart from those reserved to Westminster. If an act of the Scottish Parliament relates to a reserved matter, then it isn't law, it's outside legislative competence. And one of the reserved matters is the Union in the Scotland Act. Contrary to what Ian Davidson said, the Constitution isn't reserved. Actually, aspects of the Constitution are reserved to Westminster. So as it stands, it's arguable either way in my view, and there are a number of much more evident people than I do who would agree with that. People like Neil Walker at the University of Edinburgh argued this, Eileen McCarg, various others argued that actually you can make quite a strong case that a referendum on a reserved matter isn't necessarily contrary to the Scottish Parliament's powers. I might sound a bit opaque, but the essential test is, what's the purpose of a piece of legislation? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of legal test.
But if they blocked it on, right, you're saying there's kind of arguments either way legally with it, but if they were to block it, what would kind of be the political grounds?
Precisely, and this is the big problem. I mean, this is what's under discussion, this Section 30 idea, because Section 30 of the Scotland Act lets UK ministers change the list of powers that are reserved to Westminster, essentially. So they could do it, all you have to do, they don't have to pass a new Act of Parliament, they just have to put a statutory instrument in front of the House of Commons and the Scottish Parliament and the House of Lords. And that's it done. And if you listen to Jim Wallace and things, he was saying they don't want it to end up in court, so they want to have this referendum. But this is where they get tricky. They don't just want to have the referendum, they want there only to be one question. I think they may be more flexible on the time, potentially more flexible on the franchise, potentially more flexible on what the question is, if it's a one question.
They also still haven't given up on the wording.
No.
The recent thing I read.
They haven't, no. So their position is quite unclear. But so the kind of point is that if they wanted to fix it legally, it's so easy it isn't true. Mm-hmm. But they want to do more than just fix it so that it's immune from legal challenge. They want to dictate a few terms. They want particularly, in my view, they particularly want to stop them asking a second question on more devolution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the sticking point. And that needn't be a problem if the SNP leadership was quite happy to have one question. Mm-hmm. But the fact this is still controversial suggests to me potentially that they're quite keen on having a second question. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is likely to lead to political smash. But yeah, from the Westminster's point of view, it's going to end up a mess, because if they don't pass the Section 30 order, Holyrood is likely to legislate anyway, mm-hmm. or try. Someone's going to take it to court, or Jim Wallace, as Advocate General for Scotland, can actually refer it directly to the UK Supreme Court. Could it
go to Europe as well?
No, probably not. I mean, there's not a kind of human rights aspect to it, and there's not a kind of European Union law aspect to it. But the thing is, if we all agree we should have a referendum, mm-hmm. then I suppose what we're disagreeing about is potentially the specifics of the question. But they're all wee things, really. Mm-hmm. It's this second question thing, I think, that's the real bugger. And they'll have to sort it out soon. That's another important thing, that actually they want to pass this. They want to have a kind of 2014 date for the referendum, but the legislative timetable means we've got to get this fixed probably by the end of this year between Westminster and Holyrood. Ah. So time's a wasting, and it's not clear to me what's going on really at all.
So, a second part of the legal question. Given a yes vote, what kind of legal manoeuvrings have to go on to extricate Scotland from the United Kingdom system? I know that's an enormous question, but what would be like a few things that they would have to do?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to reach agreements on various kind of topics. For example, the seabed, although there is kind of international law on how you divide up the sea. Invariably, it's
Blair moved the border a while ago.
Well, he did in domestic law, but that's not necessarily significant for international.